Howdy Saints Allies. I'm doing a couple of videos here as a prep for our session on whiteness on December 10th. I wanted to do these videos as a way to establish kind of a definition, a working definition of whiteness before the session so that we can really kind of jump into manifestations of whiteness. I'm going to take a couple of different terms that are not normally expected in the presentation, and a couple of them have to do with language, with terms we use. And one of those is systematic whiteness. We often hear the term systematic racism, but I want to turn the tables on that to address whiteness instead of racism. Hopefully that'll make sense when I'm done here. Alrighty, let's go. Anti-racist author and educator Tim Wise, pictured here with a student, has pointed out a number of times that Euro-American social systems that disadvantage persons of color were not created by persons of color. I will either use persons of color or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous People of Color. I kind of switch off between the two. So the idea here is that no indigenous person would design a social system that would result in genocidal policies or practices. No African person would design a social system that would result in the kidnapping of millions of their kin and persons like them to be brutalized and dehumanized for hundreds of years halfway across the world. The real problem, he points out, is a systemic issue called whiteness. Another language turn I want to make is a move that's from the emerging field of critical whiteness studies, which holds that when we're talking about whiteness, we are talking about a structuring feature, not about white persons per se. There is definitely a relationship between the two, but in focusing on whiteness, we're focusing on a very depersonalized system of structuring social relationships. This doesn't excuse or dismiss the actions and dispositions of white persons, especially those who act harmfully towards persons of color, but it recognizes that we do exist in a context we don't control. So to start off with, I'm going to jump off from a recent column by Wise entitled "Systematic Racism Explained by Newton's First Law of Motion." Here's kind of a classic formulation of it. An object at rest stays at rest. An object in motion stays in motion at the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an outside force. And our cute little penguin endos it right into the tree here. One other thing that's recently formulations of this law have also pointed out that not only are they acted upon by an outside force, but by an unbalanced force. So that when they're acted upon by this force, something has to change. We also often hear of this as the law of inertia. Here's an observation from Wise's introduction in the column. The concept of inertia also applies to the socio-economic world and the forward motion of historical events. Life is not a series of single-day occurrences followed by a reset to the beginning. Instead, that which happens today will impact that which happens tomorrow, and so on. Historical events and social facts are not self-contained, right? In the case of whiteness, it is a kind of social relationships that is hundreds of years older than any of us, so it has more momentum than any one of us could deal with on our own. We were born into a system of whiteness that predates us and is larger than us. It does not rely on us for its functioning and maintenance. It has its own inertia. Now, I've said hundreds of years here. There's some discussion on when whiteness emerged. Most scholars and researchers have kind of narrowed it down as to a more recent system. So here's another point from Wise's article that's really important. It says, contrary to what some think, systematic racism is not a concept that suggests horrible racists predominate in every HR department, police station, or classroom. Systemic racism doesn't require any such persons to exist at all. Now it's really important, this is a really important point to understanding systemic whiteness. I guess in a way, systemic racism refers to the damage that this system, this structure causes, but the initiating factor is not race, it's whiteness, and hopefully we can make that clear in a moment. It's important again to understand that whiteness is not inevitable and natural, and therefore unalterable. But we do need to understand that it does have a life outside of the individuals. And we're going to talk about kind of some of those formation principles here in a moment. So let's come to a definition here real quick, start with that, and then expand on it. This first one is from Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility. Some of you may know that text. She calls whiteness an all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white, and the practices based on this assumption, an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Now, our own Dr. Leticia Nieto points out that it is an abstraction, meaning there's nothing really physical to whiteness. There's no physical basis for whiteness. And we're going to talk about what that means in a second. But as an abstraction that favors people of European descent and pushes whites to perceive the world in a predetermined pattern of white insiderness and BIPOC outsiderness. Again, and this is a system that we inherit.